If you type Tartaria into a search engine today, you'll get a mix of results, some dismissive, some sensational, and very few that actually sit down with the evidence and let it speak for itself. That's what we're going to do in this video. No dramatic claims up front. No asking you to believe anything. Just patterns, documents, and questions that deserve better answers than they've been given. Let's start with maps. Between the 1500s and the late 1700s, European cartographers produced hundreds of detailed maps of the known world. These weren't amateur sketches. They were created by some of the most respected geographers and mapmakers of their time, people like Abraham Ortelius, Gerardus Mercator, Guillaume de Lisle, and Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville. Their work was used by governments, militaries, and trade companies. These maps carried real authority. And on a striking number of them, stretching across a massive portion of the Asian continent, you'll find a single label, Tartaria. Sometimes it's called Grande Tartarie. Sometimes it's divided into regions: Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary, Muscovite Tartary. But the consistency is remarkable. We're not talking about one or two maps from a single publisher. We're talking about hundreds of maps, produced independently across different countries and decades, all recognizing this territory. The area typically shown covers an enormous stretch of land from the Ural Mountains in the west, across Siberia, down through Central Asia, and sometimes extending into parts of what we now call northern China and Manchuria. On many of these maps, Tartaria is depicted as its own distinct entity, separate from Russia, separate from China, and separate from the various khanates that mainstream history tells us occupied those regions. Now, the standard academic explanation is straightforward. Historians generally describe Tartaria as a broad European label used to refer to the lands inhabited by Turkic and Mongolic peoples, essentially a catch-all geographic term, similar to how Europeans used the word India to describe a much larger area than the modern country. The name likely derives from the Tatars, a Turkic-speaking people, with the spelling sometimes influenced by Tartarus, the Greek underworld, reflecting European fears about the Mongol invasions. That explanation makes sense on the surface. But when you spend time with these maps, certain things start to stand out. First, the level of detail. On many of these maps, Tartaria isn't just a vague, shaded region. It has marked cities, rivers, trade routes, and borders. D'Anville's maps from the mid-1700s, for example, show a level of geographic specificity that suggests more than just a rough label for unfamiliar territory. These cartographers were documenting something, whether it was a unified political entity, a cultural zone, or something else, with a degree of precision that goes beyond casual naming. Second, the longevity. The label persists across roughly 3 centuries of mapmaking. If this were simply a placeholder name born from European ignorance, you'd expect it to be corrected or refined much earlier as trade routes expanded and diplomatic contact increased. Instead, the name remained remarkably stable, even as European knowledge of Asia grew considerably during the 1600s and 1700s. Third, the disappearance. By the early 1800s, the name Tartaria begins to vanish from maps almost entirely. Within a few decades, it's gone, replaced by the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty, and various Central Asian territories. The transition is relatively abrupt in cartographic terms. A name that had appeared consistently for 300 years simply stops being used. Mainstream history attributes this to the expansion of the Russian and Chinese empires, which absorbed these territories and replaced older naming conventions. And that may well be the complete answer. Empires expand, borders shift, and old names give way to new political realities. But it's worth pausing on the speed of that disappearance, and on the question of what exactly those 3 centuries of maps were documenting. Was Tartaria purely a European invention, a convenient label with no political reality on the ground? Or were those cartographers recording something that actually existed in some organized form, something that was later absorbed and written out of the dominant historical narrative? We're not going to answer that question right now. We're going to keep looking at the evidence first. Because the maps are just the beginning. When you start examining the physical structures found across these same regions, another set of patterns starts to emerge, and those patterns raise their own set of questions. One of the most striking things about the Tartaria discussion isn't found on old maps or in dusty archives. It's found in plain sight in the buildings themselves. Across a vast geographic range, from Eastern Europe through Central Asia and into parts of East Asia, you'll find architectural features that share an unusual degree of similarity. We're talking about specific design elements: large domed roofs, classical columns, arched windows arranged in symmetrical rows, ornate facades with detailed stonework, and star-shaped fortification layouts. Individually, none of these features are unusual. Classical architecture spread widely through different periods of history. But the combination of these elements, appearing with such consistency across regions that supposedly had little cultural exchange, is worth examining more closely. Let's look at some specific examples. In cities across Russia, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kazan, Ekaterinburg, you'll find grand buildings with remarkably similar design language. Massive columned facades, intricate decorative plasterwork, and domed structures that look like they belong in the same architectural tradition. The official histories of these buildings typically attribute them to European-influenced architects working during the 18th and 19th centuries, often under the direction of the Romanov dynasty. And for many of them, construction records exist that support those timelines. But move further east into Siberia, into cities like Omsk, Tomsk, and Irkutsk, and you find buildings with strikingly similar characteristics. These are cities that, during the periods when these structures were allegedly built, were remote frontier towns. The infrastructure needed to construct large stone and brick buildings with elaborate decorative elements, the supply chains, the skilled labor, the engineering knowledge would have been extremely difficult to maintain in these locations during the 18th and 19th centuries. Yet the buildings are there. Now extend the lens further. Star-shaped fortifications, sometimes called bastion forts, appear across nearly every continent. You'll find them in Europe, in the Americas, in parts of Asia, and in locations across the former territory labeled as Tartaria on those old maps. The mainstream explanation is that this design evolved from Italian military architecture during the Renaissance and spread through European colonialism and military exchange. That's a well-documented and reasonable explanation for many of these structures. But some of these fortifications appear in locations and timelines where direct Italian or European influence is difficult to establish clearly. Take a look at photographs of institutional buildings from the 1800s across seemingly unrelated parts of the world: government buildings in the United States, cathedrals in South America, municipal buildings in Australia, and administrative buildings across the Russian Empire. The design language is often remarkably consistent. Similar proportions, similar decorative motifs, similar structural approaches. The conventional explanation is that neoclassical architecture became a global standard during this period, spread through colonial networks and international architectural trends. And that's true to a point. What makes this worth questioning is the scale. We're not talking about a handful of buildings in major capital cities with direct access to international architects. We're talking about thousands of buildings, many in relatively isolated locations, all displaying a level of craftsmanship and engineering that would have required enormous resources and expertise. In many cases, the official construction histories describe these buildings being erected in remarkably short time frames, sometimes just a few years, in locations that had only recently been settled or developed. Let's look at this from a practical standpoint. Consider what it takes to construct a large stone building with classical columns, arched windows, and decorative stonework. You need quarried stone or high-quality brick. You need skilled masons and carvers. You need engineers who understand load-bearing design, arches, and dome construction. You need transportation infrastructure to move heavy materials to the building's site. And you need time, usually a lot of it. For buildings in major European capitals, all of this makes sense. Paris, London, Rome, these cities had centuries of accumulated building knowledge, established supply chains, and large populations of skilled workers. But when you see the same caliber of construction in remote Siberian towns, in frontier cities across the American Midwest, or in newly established colonial outposts, the logistics become harder to account for. Some researchers have pointed to another detail that shows up repeatedly in construction photographs from the 1800s. Many of these photographs, which were taken during what is officially described as the construction or renovation of major buildings, show small numbers of workers relative to the scale of the project. In several cases, the photographs seem to show workers modifying or repairing existing structures rather than building them from the ground up. This is an observation, not a conclusion, but it's a pattern that appears often enough to be worth noting. There's also the question of buried floors. In cities around the world, you can find buildings where the ground floor appears to be partially or fully underground. Windows that logically should be at street level are instead sitting below grade, sometimes by several feet. In some cases, what appears to be the first floor of a building is actually the second or third floor, with lower levels buried beneath the current street level. We'll come back to that observation in more detail later. For now, the architectural evidence raises a set of questions that are worth holding on to as we move to the next layer of this discussion, because when you look at the historical record itself, you start to notice that the documentation for some of these structures, and for the broader history of the regions where they're found, has some notable gaps. Every historian will tell you that the historical record is incomplete. That's not controversial, it's simply the nature of studying the past. Documents get lost. Libraries burn. Wars destroy archives. Political transitions lead to the reorganization, and sometimes the deliberate destruction, of records from previous administrations. This is acknowledged openly in academic circles, and it applies to every civilization and every period of history. But there's a difference between general incompleteness and specific, concentrated gaps, and when you look at the regions and time periods relevant to the Tartaria discussion, some of those gaps become hard to ignore. Let's start with Russia. The Romanov dynasty, which ruled from 1613 to 1917, oversaw a dramatic transformation of Russian society, culture, and territorial boundaries. Under Peter the Great in the early 1700s, Russia underwent rapid westernization, new administrative systems, a new capital city in St. Petersburg, new cultural norms, and a deliberate effort to reposition Russia as a European power. This is well-documented history. What's less frequently discussed is what happened to the records of the period before the Romanovs. The time of troubles, the period of political instability that preceded Romanov rule, saw significant disruption to Russian institutions, including record-keeping. And Peter the Great's reforms included a comprehensive restructuring of the Russian calendar, administrative systems, and historical archives. When a new regime restructures the systems that record history, it inevitably raises questions about what was preserved, what was modified, and what was lost. This isn't speculation about a conspiracy. It's a basic observation about how political transitions affect historical documentation. We see the same pattern in other contexts. When the Spanish colonized the Americas, vast quantities of indigenous records, codices, oral histories, architectural knowledge were deliberately destroyed. When China transitioned between dynasties, incoming rulers routinely rewrote the histories of their predecessors. The British Empire systematically destroyed colonial records during the process of decolonization in the 20th century, a practice that has been documented and studied by historians like Anthony Carey. So the question isn't whether historical records get lost or altered during political transitions. The question is whether the specific gaps in the record around the regions formerly labeled as Tartaria follow this same pattern, and if so, what was there before? The Encyclopédie, the massive French reference work published between 1751 and 1772 by Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent D'Alembert, contains entries referencing Tartaria as a distinct geographic and cultural region. The Britannica editions from the late 1700s do the same. These weren't fringe publications. They were the most authoritative reference works of their time, compiled by leading scholars. And they describe Tartaria with a level of detail that suggests their authors considered it a real, identifiable place, not just a vague label for unknown territory. By the mid-1800s, however, references to Tartaria in major encyclopedias begin to shrink. By the early 1900s, they've largely disappeared. The territory that was once labeled Tartaria is now fully absorbed into the Russian Empire and the Qing dynasty, and the name itself is treated as an outdated geographic term with no modern relevance. There's also the question of world's fairs and expositions. During the second half of the 1800s, major international exhibitions were held in cities around the world: London, Paris, Chicago, St. Louis, Melbourne, and others. These events featured enormous, architecturally elaborate exhibition halls and pavilions, many of which were described in official records as temporary structures built specifically for the event. The scale of some of these buildings is genuinely difficult to reconcile with the temporary label. The structures at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, for example, covered hundreds of acres and featured massive classical buildings with columns, domes, and sculptural details that would challenge modern construction firms working with contemporary equipment. According to the official record, these buildings were designed, constructed, used for a few months, and then demolished, all within a span of roughly 2 to 3 years. Photographs of these expositions survive in large numbers, and they show structures of extraordinary complexity and beauty. The official explanation is that they were built using a technique called staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber applied over temporary wooden and steel frameworks. And for many of the structures, this explanation is supported by construction records and contemporary accounts. But some researchers have noted that certain buildings at these expositions appear to have features: deep foundations, heavy masonry, elaborate underground levels that seem inconsistent with temporary construction methods. This observation doesn't prove anything on its own. It simply adds another data point to a pattern we keep seeing: structures that seem to exceed what the official timeline and available resources would easily account for. When you combine this with the cartographic evidence from Chapter 1 and the architectural patterns from Chapter 2, a picture begins to form: not a definitive picture, but a set of recurring questions that point in a similar direction. And those questions become even more interesting when you look at a specific physical phenomenon that has been documented in cities around the world. Of all the threads in the Tartaria discussion, this one tends to generate the most debate, and understandably so, because it deals with a physical observation that is genuinely difficult to explain in a single, clean narrative. The observation is this: in cities across multiple continents, there are buildings whose lowest floors appear to be buried. Windows that were clearly designed to let in light and air sit partially or fully below the current street level. Doors open onto stairwells that lead down to what should be the ground floor. In some cases, entire levels of buildings are underground, accessible only through basement entrances, even though architectural details suggest these levels were originally designed as primary, above-ground spaces. You can see this in cities across Europe: in Prague, Edinburgh, and throughout Russia. You can see it in older American cities. Portland, Oregon has an entire network of underground passages and buried storefronts that were once at street level. Seattle, Washington was famously rebuilt on top of its original street level after the Great Fire of 1889, and you can still tour the old ground-level streets and storefronts that now sit beneath the modern city. The mainstream explanations for buried buildings vary by location. In some cases, cities deliberately raised their street levels for drainage or sanitation purposes. Seattle is a clear example of this. The decision to raise the streets is well documented in city records. In other cases, natural sediment accumulation over decades or centuries gradually raised the ground level around existing structures. In flood-prone areas, repeated flooding deposited layers of silt and mud that were eventually built over rather than removed. These explanations are reasonable, and they account for many of the observed cases. But proponents of what's sometimes called the mud flood theory argue that the sheer number of buried buildings worldwide, and the consistency of the phenomenon across very different geographic and climatic conditions, suggests something more widespread than localized flooding or municipal engineering projects. Let's look at the photographic evidence. Photographs from the mid to late 1800s show cities in various states of reconstruction. In many of these photographs, you can see workers excavating around buildings, digging out lower floors, and clearing debris from structures that appear to have been partially buried. The conventional interpretation is that these photos show routine urban development, grading, foundation work, and infrastructure improvement. And in many cases, that's likely exactly what they show. But in some photographs, the details are harder to square with that explanation. Buildings with elaborate architectural detailing on their buried lower floors, carved stonework, decorative window frames, formal entryways, features that make no sense on a basement level that was designed to be underground. Why would a builder put their most ornate work on a level that was never meant to be seen? There are also photographs from Russian cities in the late 1800s and early 1900s showing what appears to be large-scale excavation of buildings from accumulated earth and debris. In some of these images, the buried portions of the buildings are architecturally identical to the portions above ground, suggesting they were originally built as visible, occupied spaces. The reset theory takes these observations and connects them to the broader Tartaria narrative. The theory proposes that at some point the exact timing varies depending on who you ask. A large-scale catastrophic event, or series of events, deposited massive amounts of mud and sediment across wide areas, burying existing structures and infrastructure. According to this theory, the civilization that built these structures was either destroyed or displaced by the event, and the buildings were later excavated, repurposed, or built upon by subsequent populations who claimed them as their own. This is where we need to be very careful about separating observation from interpretation. The buried buildings are real. You can visit them. You can photograph them. The photographic evidence from the 1800s is real and publicly available. These are observable, measurable phenomena. The interpretation that they result from a single catastrophic event connected to the fall of a Tartarian civilization is a much larger claim that currently lacks the kind of direct documentary or geological evidence that would move it from theory to established fact. There is no widely accepted geological record of a single global mud event in the recent historical past. There is no surviving document from any known civilization that describes such an event in terms consistent with the theory. What we do have is a pattern of observations that conventional explanations address individually but perhaps not collectively. Each buried city has its own local explanation. But the question remains, is it coincidence that so many cities, across so many different regions, show the same phenomenon during roughly the same historical period? That's a question worth sitting with honestly, without rushing to either dismiss it or inflate it into something it may not be. And that question leads us naturally to the larger one, the one that ties all of these threads together. So where does all of this leave us? We started with maps, hundreds of them, spanning 3 centuries, produced by respected cartographers across Europe, all showing a vast territory called Tartaria. We looked at architecture, buildings with strikingly similar design elements appearing across distant regions, sometimes in locations where the resources and infrastructure to build them are hard to account for. We examined gaps in the historical record, periods and regions where documentation is incomplete, inconsistent, or concentrated around political transitions that are known to affect how history gets preserved. And we looked at the physical phenomenon of buried building structures around the world whose lowest levels appear to have been designed as above-ground spaces, but now sit beneath the current street level. Each of these threads, taken individually, has reasonable mainstream explanations. Tartaria was a vague geographic label. The architecture reflects the global spread of neoclassical design. The record gaps are normal consequences of political change. The buried buildings result from local flooding, urban engineering, or natural sediment accumulation. And each of those explanations may be entirely correct. But what makes the Tartaria discussion compelling to so many people isn't any single piece of evidence. It's the convergence. It's the fact that these separate observations, cartographic, architectural, documentary, and physical, all cluster around the same geographic regions, the same time periods, and the same transitional moments in history. When you see multiple independent lines of evidence pointing toward the same set of questions, it's worth asking whether the standard explanations, each of which works well in isolation, are sufficient when considered together. The mainstream academic position is clear. There was no Tartarian empire in the sense of a unified political state with its own government, culture, and infrastructure. The word, Tartaria, was a European designation for the lands of various Turkic and Mongolic peoples, and its disappearance from maps reflects the political absorption of those territories by expanding empires, primarily Russia and China. This is the position held by the vast majority of professional historians, and it's supported by a substantial body of scholarship. The alternative interpretation, and it's important to call it an interpretation rather than a proven thesis, proposes that Tartaria may have been something more than a label. That it may have referred to an actual civilization or network of civilizations with a shared architectural tradition, a shared cultural identity, and a level of technological sophistication that has been underrepresented or misattributed in conventional history. This interpretation draws on the map evidence, the architectural patterns, the record gaps, and the buried building phenomenon to suggest that our understanding of recent history, particularly the history of the 18th and 19th centuries, may be more incomplete than mainstream scholarship currently acknowledges. It's important to be honest about where the evidence stands. The physical observations, the maps, the buildings, the buried structures are real and verifiable. Anyone can examine them. The documentary evidence, encyclopedia entries, construction records, expedition accounts exists, and can be read in context. These are facts, and they deserve serious attention. The interpretive framework, the idea of a lost Tartarian civilization, a catastrophic reset event, a deliberate suppression of history, remains a theory. It connects real observations in a way that many people find compelling, but it has not yet been substantiated by the kind of direct, primary source evidence that would be needed to overturn established historical narratives. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It means it's unproven, and there's an important difference between those two things. What this discussion really highlights is something broader about how we engage with history. We tend to treat historical narratives as settled and complete, when in reality, they are always being revised, expanded, and sometimes corrected. New archaeological discoveries regularly change our understanding of past civilizations. Declassified documents reveal aspects of recent history that were previously unknown. The history we learn in school is not false, but it is necessarily simplified, and simplification always involves choices about what to include and what to leave out. The Tartaria discussion, whatever you ultimately make of it, is an invitation to look more carefully. To notice the details in old maps and ask why they're there. To stand in front of a building in a remote city and ask how it got there. To read an old encyclopedia entry and ask why it says something different from what we're told today. These are not radical acts. They're the basic habits of anyone who takes history seriously. This video hasn't asked you to believe anything. It's asked you to look at what's there: the maps, the buildings, the records, the ground beneath your feet, and to consider whether the explanations we've been given account for everything we can observe. If they do, that's fine. If they don't, then the honest response isn't to make up an answer. It's to keep asking the question. And that's what good history has always been about.